When you are walking on your favorite forest path, have you ever wondered why you see different tree species or why there are trees of different sizes? Obviously, trees grow by themselves, but there are also 16 million forest owners in Europe that make decisions on the trees that we see in our forests. But on what are their decisions rooted? Cash, climate, culture, perhaps even something else? My name is Verkerk, and in this ForestChat podcast episode, we are branching out with Florencia Franzini to decode how Europe's forest practitioners think, choose, and act. So if you've ever wondered what steers Europe's forest, stick around. So welcome, Florencia, at the third episode of the ForestChat podcast. Can you perhaps shortly introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Hans. I'm Florencia Franzini, and I'm a senior researcher for European Forest Institute.
Within the project, you studied the factors that are influencing the decisions taken by forest owners and managers. So we sometimes refer to them as practitioners. Why? What was the purpose of this? Why did you do this?
The central theme of my work in ForestPaths in studying European forest practitioners, my main prerogative has been to try to understand these individuals from the perspective of their decision-making behaviors and understanding the what, how, and why of what they choose to do with European forests.
But can you tell us still a bit more about the why, Florencia? So why is it important to look into these topics? So why it is important to look into the behavior of forest practitioners or owners and managers?
Yes, that is a very good question and also a very loaded question. So in my mind, the reality is that land use decision questions have always been a bit historically important to every society, kind of irrespective of the time period they're situated in, because how humans interact with land, it shapes the very fabric of our society. And land represents not only the physical space over which we organize, but it's also the foundation over which we mobilize resources necessary to maintain our society. What's a bit unique across moments and times are the modalities of governance through which societies arrange and direct their land use decisions, right? And in this moment in time, in the European Union and in the member states, we're organized so that the rights to make decisions over lands, they're tied to our property rights, meaning that private entities can have as much of a choice over what to do with land as a public entity does. And in fact, when we talk about forest practitioners, who we refer to are really different types of individuals. You have private citizens who own forest lands. You have private corporations or private foundations who can own forest lands. And of course, you also have public institutions at all levels, so local government to national government, and they can own forest land. And this ownership essentially means that the entity has a bundle of rights over the land, one of which is the right of enjoyment, as it's called. And this means that the owner can actually use the land for whatever purpose or activity they see fit under the confines of the law. And so one big example of this is actually resource extraction. And so here we start to come to the heart of the matter of why it's important to understand the decision-making behaviors of forest practitioners. Forests provide society with a lot of direct and indirect benefits, so raw materials, carbon sequestration, water filtration, etc. And we call these ecosystem services, by the way. And understanding forest practitioners is about understanding the activities that are happening across European forests, so we can better understand how these activities may shape and impact the availability of these forest benefits to our society. So this is a bit of a complex answer, but this is a little bit why it's important.
Yeah, and it's quite broad what you're saying, because you talk about land use in general, but of course in ForestPaths we focus on a bit narrower topic. It's still quite broad, I think. We focus on how forests can contribute to climate change mitigation, how we can better manage our forests to take into account the impacts of climate change, and how we can improve or avoid further loss of biodiversity. So I guess in this context, this is how you are framed your research, right?
Yeah, I mostly agree, and I also believe that land use change, it does form also some part of the discussions that happen in this research, because of course land use change can be an activity. I mean, whether a person that owns a forest chooses to keep their land as a forest land is a management choice that they make. And it is something that should be considered to impact how forest practitioners make their choices. Do they choose to keep the forest, or do they choose to convert their forest? I think this is a question that remains.
And how did you actually contact them? I mean, there are 16 million owners in Europe. Did you talk with all of them? How did you approach this?
This is a good question. So we had two different phases of the work, by the way. We have interviews and we have surveys. And in the context of the interviews, we contacted forest practitioners through a little bit of what is called snowball sampling or convenience sampling. And essentially, we knew that we were looking for different types of forest practitioners. And we were a little bit trying to find as many different types as possible and contacting them through people that we know. In the case of the survey, this sampling was very different. This is done through a panel study. And essentially, we create a survey, we give it to a polling company, and the polling company sends the survey out to various panel members across the different countries which we've selected to target. So it depends a little bit here on what phase of the research you're talking.
Okay, yeah, but you have to make a choice. So you of course you cannot talk to everyone, but through interviews you can perhaps go a bit deeper and ask what people think, and in surveys you can go contact more people, but perhaps a little bit less detailed as compared to.
Definitely.
So if you then look a bit in the interviews, what you had, can you describe a bit what are the objectives that forest managers have that you come across within?
Sure. Maybe the first thing that might be relevant is to define a little bit what we mean here by forest objectives. And in the context of this research, forest objectives were explicitly the forest practitioner's goal for the forest and the outcomes that they sought to fulfill through their forest. And there were various different kinds of objectives that people have and expectations that people have for their forests. The way that we ended up structuring it in the research is that we actually structured the objectives according to whether the expected outcome of the forest would fulfill one of the ecosystem services. These are the things that I was mentioning earlier. And so you have provisioning services, which are kind of like the tangible goods that you extract from the forest, like, for example, timber. You have cultural services, which is kind of these intangible things that we do in the forest that give us fulfillment or emotional or spiritual fulfillment, things like.
You mean like going to the forest for recreational purposes, or just to enjoy the presence of the forest?
Exactly. And the third services are the regulating services. And so these are kind of these like water filtration, carbon sequestration. These are the kind of biogeochemical things that happen in the forest that are also beneficial to maintaining life on Earth as we know it.
Okay. And so you also talked about different types of owners, like typologies, I think you mentioned earlier, but also there's a broad difference between public and private owners. So do you see differences in objectives or in other things between different types of forest managers and owners?
Sure. I would say that maybe it's more difficult to answer for the forest management objectives, because I believe that all types and practitioner types, you can nest their objectives under these kind of three different ecosystem services. But perhaps what tends to vary most amongst public forest managers and private forest managers are a little bit the drivers of why they have these objectives, right? And there are many things, but maybe I just give one example. So with public managers, it's very evident that one of the biggest drivers for them is that they are trying to fulfill a public good. Forests are a public good, and they want the public to be able to use the forest. So, for example, they might want the public to be able to go and do some hiking, or in some countries they can do berry picking or mushroom picking, etc. But the really big difference between private owners and public managers is that public managers, they are making choices about their objectives based on the organization that they're working in, right? It's not owned by a singular person who gets to decide. You, as a public manager, are part of a larger organization which is making choices that is driven by many things that perhaps a private owner doesn't have to contend with. So like this idea of providing a service for the public, a private owner doesn't necessarily feel that pressure the same way that a public manager does. So there you have already, I think, two different kind of drivers. So the social dynamics, but then also the organizational dynamics and things that private owners don't have to deal with.
Yeah, of course, you do perhaps different things if you work for a company than if you decide for yourself. And but you say there's also different. These factors are like leading to people having different objectives, but do they also lead to different behavior? Are there different decisions that are taken, or is this not so? Is it not so clear or not so?
Well, of course, the research doesn't. So in this research, it's more explorative. So one of the aims wasn't necessarily to take like two different activities and figure out why one activity is taken over the other. So that wasn't really the purpose of this research, which makes it a little bit difficult to answer this question. But I would say that the activities that we looked at, they were very concrete. We were searching for very concrete activities. So what kind of felling practices do practitioners do? What kind of regeneration practices do they take on? And in some cases, I would say that the practices that they take on have to do with the objectives that they have, but in some cases, it's actually the other way around, that some practices might also lead to certain objectives. I don't know if this really answers your question, though, Hans. This is a very difficult question.
Yeah, but can you explain that last part a little bit? So why you have different practices that lead to different objectives? I can understand the other way around, the other one, but what you say is perhaps a bit more complicated.
Yes, I don't know. I'd have to think about it, Hans. I know there's some examples, but yeah, off the top of my head.
But I think you're saying in general that there's not directly an objective that leads to a particular behavior. It's not been totally the topic of your study, but it's also not totally what you see. The people take decisions in different ways. There are different factors that are shaping their decisions, but how this turn into the decisions they take, that is something that we have not directly looked at.
Yes, and I mean, I think that the reason why it's so difficult to answer the previous question is that sometimes practices. So this thing about how do practices also manage to change your objectives? I think it's because when we're looking at the kind of systems in which people operate in, we're thinking a lot about like the societal individual level. So, I have an objective for my forest. I want to do this, and then I engage in this kind of practice. So, for example, this is a kind of figurative example. I want to sell timber, so I clear cut my forest, and then I can sell timber. But then this activity might actually have an unexpected environmental effect or in the kind of ecological system. So this kind of like clear cutting, it might lead to an unexpected outcome in the environment, which then means that I have to shift my management practices into something else to kind of compensate for this unexpected change. So I think that, decision-making behaviors are really iterative, and they're not really linear in a lot of ways. And a management activity might also have unexpected consequences that form new drivers that you didn't have when you originally made the choice that you made. So it's always a little bit tough when we talk about decisions in forest management, because forests also, they have a very strong temporal dynamic. A tree can be in the forest for 50 years, 100 years. And so this means that decision-making, it's not just a one moment in time, it's something that kind of evolves over time. And that's how people kind of course correct, I think, their objectives, how certain practices might lead to new objectives.
Okay, yeah, that's clear. I mean, the example that you gave I guess one could be that you have a forest, and as you say, you cut it, but the trees they use water, they drink water and then they evaporate it. Also, but if you then remove all the trees, then that affects on the water balance. So you might have a rise in the amount of water, the water level. So you have some flooding happening, and you might need to take actions then actually to take care of those. So they were not your management intention to take care of those, but you need to react to the conditions that have been created by a previous action.
Yes, and I think actually now that you're saying this, I kind of remember what I was thinking of originally, which was a little bit like funny to me when I was reading some of the interviews. So there are some forest practitioners who want to a little bit transition away from clear cutting into more selective felling. But it's really funny that in order to kind of go through this transition, they have to do a little bit of like forest regeneration. So, for example, there's a case where there's like a monoculture. So, there's like one species and they want to regenerate this monoculture so that they can have multiple species in that forest and that they can transition towards more clear cutting practices. But to do this regeneration, they actually had to clear cut. And so they were a little bit doing a practice that they didn't really approve of in the first place as a transitionatory practice to get to where they want to go. So I think that this also shows like the challenges in making forest management decisions that, when we might be really strongly opposed to certain practices, but they might still have a moment where they are relevant to achieve a larger goal.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So that I think you show here something that is surprising that came out of the interviews. Do you have other examples of stuff that you see or like issues that have been raised in the discussions, in the interviews that you find interesting or funny, perhaps even?
Yes, I have to say that I actually found a lot of the interviews super interesting. Probably every single one had something that really kind of surprised me or that was really interesting to me. I think that's the nice part about interviews. You come across all kinds of things. And maybe one thing that really struck me about all of these interviews is that all of the practitioners that we spoke to, they actually have one objective, which maybe isn't so much captured by framing objectives as forest ecosystem services, but all of them have the objective to keep their forest as a forest. And we were talking earlier about this question of land use change. I mean, nobody has to keep their forest as forest, technically. You can change the use of your land. Sometimes there are maybe regulatory reasons or legal reasons why you're not allowed to, but in many cases you can. And it really becomes clear that all of these practitioners, they all want to actually keep the forest as a forest. Now, what that forest looks like might be different for all of the practitioners, but the point is they want to keep their forest as forest. And the most interesting example for me was that case of one interviewee who was a forest owner who we would essentially classify as somebody who has abandoned their forest. And this is because it's a person who never goes to their forest property. They live very far away. They have self-claimed that they have no emotional connection to their forest. They do the bare minimum amount of management, which is legally required in their country. So they do that. And the thing is, they have been thinking about selling their forest because they just don't want to keep it. But the thing that kind of creates a lot of anxiety for this individual, even though they have essentially abandoned their forest, is that they're afraid to sell it because they don't want the land use to be converted. They don't want their forest to turn into housing development, and they don't want their forest to turn into agricultural land, like for food. So this, I think, is really interesting. This kind of desire for practitioners that they want to keep the forest as forest. Perhaps the only exception to this rule, I have to say, was one landowner who had quite a lot of land. So they have the luxury of being able to parse their land into different uses. And they had contemplated the idea of actually converting their land to agriculture so that they could get more money than they got from industrial forest production. So I thought that was quite fun.
You did interviews with multiple people, so but also with people from different countries. Are there any differences that you see between different parts of Europe? Is everybody doing the same, or are the ideas, the objectives, are they different?
For sure, I have to say that yes, things, of course, they are very different, and I think that maybe I take a step back to explain something here that about the practitioners. And So the main goal of the interviews, it was to try to have as wide of a selection of individuals as possible, and also in as many countries as possible. And the rationale for this was a little bit twofold. And I think most people would agree with the notion that the underlying reason for why individuals make decisions, it can often vary due to personal preferences. So for example, Hans, you might choose chocolate ice cream for dessert, and I will choose vanilla ice cream. And we know that we make different choices because we have different underlying preferences. But there is more to it than that. And these forest practitioners, they operate in different places. And that means that the rules for what and how decisions are made can actually differ between forest practitioners due to, for example, their national laws. So people can be constrained in their choices based on their location. And this constraint isn't only due to their societal system, by the way. It's also an ecological system constraint. The reality is that we're also limited by our geography. And for example, the types of species that you can plant across different regions in Europe, they also differ. So there's kind of this need to capture a lot of different variations. And that's why we had so many different practitioner types and country types in these studies, so that we could get a little bit of a sample for this variation.
So you're referring also to a little bit the different conditions and so on. I would like to talk a little bit about the context of climate change, because in the previous podcast we talked with Alba about forest disturbances and climate change impacts. Is this something that comes back, or that you see in the interviews that you?
Yes, I have to say that it is, and there is a kind of a caveat here, which is that the purpose of these interviews was also to understand a little bit about how climate change and what types of practices are kind of evolving out of the concern for climate change. So we did really ask a little bit explicitly about this. We asked explicitly whether people were interested in managing their forest for climate change, and how they did this, or how they would do this if they're not doing it. So this was a large part of the discussion for sure. Climate comes up, and we do see that climate is a driver. It's like a value that some, for example, forest owners have. They are driven by this concern for climate change. And so they want to make choices that are going to help, for example, their forest adapt to climate change. So there are some management activities that forest practitioners are taking on to help with forest adaptation. So we do see some of this in the interviews.
Can you give some examples of activities that they have mentioned, that what they are doing?
It's very different for different localities. So I think that's why it's a little bit difficult for me now to think of all of the examples. But for example, there is a desire to have more native species in some areas. There is a desire to,
like a native tree species.
Yes, native tree species. So there is this kind of recognition of having more native tree species, but not always, because also in some context there's a desire to have what are called adapted tree species. So they might not have been originally native, and they might come from somewhere else, but they are expected to thrive under the changing conditions which are a result of climate change across Europe. So I have to say that I also find this very interesting, because when I was growing up, we learned that, native species are the most important and exotic species are kind of seen to be a bit dangerous. And today we are starting to a little bit explore what does it mean to adapt forest to changing climate, and what kind of species are then more or less acceptable. And I still think there's a lot of subjectivity, a layer of subjectivity involved in this that we are still, I think, as forest researchers, learning about.
Well, of course, it doesn't mean that it's automatically trees that come from other continents, but it can also be trees that are, or species that are in your neighboring country. But because climate change, we see that the conditions are changing. And if you plant a tree now, it needs to survive now, but it also needs to survive in 80 or 100 years from now. So the conditions in the future can be quite different. So it might be useful also to look at the species of your neighboring country to see what is there, what what could potentially grow in 100 years from now, when we will have those environmental or climate conditions taking.
Yeah, fully agree. And maybe the one thing that I would add is that, I think sometimes we discuss a lot of things in forestry, certain practices as very kind of black and white, like, whether something is good or something is bad. Are exotic species actually bad? Are they good? And it's not so black and white, the choices that we make in forestry. And I think it comes back to this that we were discussing earlier about complexity and the time scales and the temporal dimension. I mean, there are a lot of unexpected repercussions sometimes for the management activities that we take on, and what might be a good choice in one place might not necessarily be a good choice in another. So we can't just, look at everything and give like a blanket binary, oh, this practice is always bad and this practice is always good.
Okay, this is perhaps also a nice bridge into one of my last questions that I have for you. So how can your results be used? Like how does it help policymakers? Can it help policymakers to know these factors, to know what are the objectives and how management is being done? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. I see this research myself personally as explorative research, and I think that the idea was to scale the research and the factors up to this survey that I mentioned earlier. So this idea that we could reach out to more forest practitioners and get more information so that we can start to understand whether there are certain management activities or drivers that are kind of explicit to certain geographical regions or something like this. And in them of themselves, I think that interviews represent a good foundation, but it's much more difficult to use interviews to give recommendations. Of course, this is my own philosophy as a researcher, and perhaps it's also a question of skill, and somebody more skilled might make better policy recommendations out of qualitative research than I can. But this is how I see it.
Okay. So I think you're hinting a little bit to what are the next things, right? You're referring to a survey. So this is a topic for the future, or you're working on that already?
Yes, we already actually launched a survey to 13 different European countries. And the goal of the survey was to reach different types of forest practitioners and try to get a sense for how strong certain drivers might be towards management practices. And again, to understand, what is the role of the practitioner type? What is the role of the country, if any, in how these management decisions are made? So this is the work so we have the survey data, and this is the work that I've been currently analyzing.
Okay, but to me that sounds the topic of a fourth podcast.
Maybe. Hopefully, yes.
I would like to thank you for this. I think it'd be very interesting, the work that you have been doing. I would also like to thank the listeners again for this podcast, and I hope you keep excited about our results and keep an eye on what's coming next. Thanks. A big thank you to Florencia for guiding us through the fascinating factors that are shaping decision-making on Europe's forests. If you'd like to follow the journey and see how this research develops, follow the ForestPaths project. Until next time, and stay curious.